read the books. You know what the shadow is. You understand, at least conceptually, that individuation means the death of the person you've been in order to become something more complete. You've watched the videos, sat with the ideas, maybe even been through therapy. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you've nodded at the concept of ego death with the quiet confidence of someone who gets it. Jung saw you coming. In Aion, one of the most demanding texts he ever produced, Jung identified something that doesn't get talked about in the psychology content you've been consuming. He called it psychic inflation. And it doesn't happen to people who are ignorant of psychology. It happens precisely to those who know enough to use the vocabulary of transformation as a shield against transformation itself. The ego, Jung observed, is intelligent enough to learn the language of change and use it to avoid changing. It absorbs the concept of the dying self and wears it as an identity. You become the person who understands that the old self must die, which is the most elegant way imaginable to keep that old self alive. This is not a video about what individuation is. You already know that. This is a video about the specific mechanism by which people who understand individuation use that understanding to escape it. And what Jung said happens to those people when the psyche decides to stop waiting. Because here is what the comfortable versions of this material never tell you. The psyche does not stop its process just because the ego refuses to cooperate. It intensifies. What you will not do consciously, voluntarily, with your eyes open, the unconscious will do to you, through crisis, through loss, through collapse, that arrives not as punishment, but as mechanism, as the psychic law Jung named enantiodromia. Anything carried to its extreme converts into its opposite. The choice in front of you is not whether the old self dies. It is whether you are present for the death, or whether it happens to you while you're looking the other way. The intellectual grasp of a psychological fact, Jung wrote in Aion, produces no more than a concept of it, and a concept is no more than a name, what he called in Latin a flatus vocis, a breath of air. These intellectual counters, he said, pass lightly from hand to hand. They have no weight or substance. They sound full, but are hollow. You know what psychic inflation is. You know it describes the ego that absorbs the language of transformation and mistakes the map for the territory. You can probably explain it to someone else. And the fact that you can explain it is precisely the problem. Because the ego is not stupid. It does not resist transformation by ignoring the concept. It resists transformation by becoming the concept. It wraps itself in the vocabulary of growth the way a body wraps itself in a coat. The coat is not the warmth. The name is not the thing. This is not a metaphor Jung left vague. In Aion, he is surgical about the mechanism. The more unconscious contents a person integrates intellectually, the more the ego inflates. Not with arrogance, not with obvious pride, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has done the work. The inflation is not felt as inflation. It is felt as depth. It is felt as self-awareness. It is felt as exactly the kind of growth that is actually happening in someone who is genuinely changing. That is what makes it invisible. The symptoms of inflation and the symptoms of real individuation can look identical from the inside. Here is where the trap closes. Because a person in genuine psychic inflation does not feel stuck. They feel like they are ahead of the curve. They are the one in the room who understands why people self-sabotage, who can name defense mechanisms in real time, who sees through social conditioning that others have not even begun to question. The intellectual sophistication is real. The insight is often accurate. What is absent is not intelligence. It is cost. Real transformation extracts something from you. It does not add to your existing understanding. It undoes something you were counting on. If the process of the last 2 years has left you feeling more equipped, more knowing, more articulate about your inner life, but essentially intact, that is the signature of inflation, not individuation. What makes this so difficult to see is that the inflation carries genuine insight inside it. The person caught in it is not wrong about what they know. They are wrong about what knowing means. They have learned, without realizing it, that understanding a pain makes it manageable, that naming a wound gives you distance from it, authority over it, the comfortable feeling of being in relationship with it rather than inside it. But distance is not healing. Authority over a concept is not freedom from what the concept describes. You can spend a decade understanding your attachment wounds and still flinch at the same moment, with the same person, in the same way you always have. The understanding accumulates. The pattern persists. And because the understanding is real, the persistence of the pattern becomes almost impossible to admit. So look honestly at what has changed in you over the last 2 years of reading and listening and understanding. Not what you now know. What have you actually given up? What specific thing, identity, behavior, relationship, self-concept, has died in you against your will because the psyche demanded it? If the answer is unclear, if it takes a moment to find something real, you now know exactly which part of the process you are stuck in. What you are protecting has a name. The next question is why the psyche, even when you refuse to cooperate, does not simply let you stay there. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Picture the person who has known for years that their marriage is wrong. Not unhappy in the ordinary way, wrong at the level of identity. They know it. They have known it through every conversation, every silence, every morning that starts with a feeling they cannot name. And yet they stay. They stay because the alternative is too large, because the version of themselves that leaves does not yet exist, because the version of themselves that exists cannot survive what leaving would require. They manage the knowledge. They become skilled at managing it. And then one day, without warning, something collapses. Health, work, a relationship outside the marriage. And the life they were maintaining disintegrates around them in a way they did not choose and cannot control. This is not bad luck. This is the law Jung named enantiodromia. The term comes from Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who observed that all things eventually turn into their opposites. Jung made it a clinical principle. In Aion, he describes it in the context of civilizational cycles, but the mechanism operates with equal precision inside a single life. Any attitude, any resistance, any structure maintained with sufficient intensity will eventually convert into its opposite. Not because fate is cruel, but because the psyche is a system, and systems under sustained pressure that cannot release will eventually release catastrophically. What this means for you is specific. The psyche does not make moral judgments about your refusal to change. It does not punish you for it. It simply continues the process of individuation at the level it has access to, which, when the ego refuses to cooperate, is the level of events, of external circumstances, of the body. Jung put it plainly: when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. The suffering you avoid internally does not disappear, it relocates. This is why the pattern is so difficult to recognize while you are inside it. The collapse, when it comes, always arrives with a convincing external cause. The job ended. The relationship broke. The body failed. The story you tell yourself is about circumstances. The story the psyche is telling is about a transformation that could not be completed from the inside, and so was completed from the outside instead. The container broke because the pressure exceeded it. The uncomfortable precision of this is not that crisis will come. It is that the crisis is not random. It arrives specifically shaped to dismantle the structure you were most committed to preserving. The thing that breaks is never incidental. It is always the thing that the old self depended on most completely to remain itself, which is why its loss feels not just painful, but annihilating. You are not just losing a job or a relationship. You were losing the architecture that held a particular version of you together. And here is what none of this means. It does not mean that suffering is a sign you are on the right path. It does not mean that crisis is therapeutic. It means that the psyche will complete its process through whatever channel remains open. Conscious and voluntary descent is one channel. Loss, collapse, and external rupture are others. The process does not care which one you use. Jung's image for this, in Aion, is stark in its simplicity. He writes that anyone destined to descend into a deep pit had better set about it with all the necessary precautions rather than risk falling into the hole backwards. The descent is not optional. The direction is. Which raises the question this video has been circling from the beginning. If the descent is not optional, what does it actually mean to choose it? Compensation. That is the word Jung uses in Aion for what the psyche does when the ego refuses to complete what it has started. The unconscious compensates, not with comfort, not with patience, but with pressure applied precisely to the structure the ego is most committed to maintaining. And this means that the death of the old self, when it comes voluntarily, does not feel like liberation. It feels like amputation. This is where most psychological content fails you. The language of transformation, shedding the old self, stepping into wholeness, becoming who you were meant to be, carries an implicit promise of relief, as if the dying part were a coat you were tired of wearing, as if the new self were waiting just underneath, warm and ready. That is not what Jung describes, and it is not what his patients reported. And it is almost certainly not what you have experienced in the moments when real change actually moved through you. Think of a time when something in you genuinely shifted. Not an insight, not a realization, but an actual change in how you moved through the world. Something different about what you reached for, what you no longer needed, what you stopped defending. If you can locate that moment, notice what preceded it. It was almost certainly not a decision. It was almost certainly a loss. Of a self-concept you had organized your life around, of a role that had been giving you something you did not know you were taking from it. The perfectionist who cannot stop is not failing to relax. They are protecting an identity that has kept them safe since childhood. The person who cannot stop helping is not being kind. They are maintaining a self-concept that tells them they matter only in relation to what they provide. The one who cannot stop achieving is not ambitious. They are running from the silence that would exist if they stopped. These are not character flaws. They are the old self doing exactly what the old self does. Surviving. And survival is the correct word. Because the ego does not maintain the old self out of laziness or cowardice. It maintains it because that self was built to solve a real problem, at a real moment, in a real life. The child who learned that love was conditional developed the people-pleaser not out of weakness, but out of precision. The structure worked. It kept them safe. And the psyche does not abandon structures that worked without demanding something in return. What it demands is grief. Specific, targeted grief for the specific thing that must end. Not insight about the pattern, not understanding of its origins, not compassion for the child who built it. Those are valuable, but they are not the grief itself. The grief is the felt experience of letting the structure go without knowing yet what will replace it, which is the part no one warns you about. Because real psychological death is not followed immediately by rebirth. There is an interval. Jung describes it across his work as the nekia, the night sea journey, the descent into formlessness before the new form emerges. That interval has no vocabulary, no map, no evidence that what comes next will be better. What you can do in that interval is this. Notice the moment when the old self reaches for its usual defense, and you feel, simultaneously, the reach and the awareness of the reach. That gap, between the impulse and the identification with it, is the only place where voluntary dying actually happens, not in understanding, in that specific gap, in that specific moment, choosing not to reach. The question is what fills the space when you don't. That is what the next part answers. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You have done this thousands of times without noticing. Someone asks you to be different, more vulnerable, less controlled, less available, more present, and something in you contracts. Not with resistance exactly, with something quieter and more total than resistance. A kind of structural refusal, as if the request were not just inconvenient, but incompatible with something load-bearing inside you. That contraction is not a flaw. It is a function. In Aion, Jung makes a distinction that most readers pass over too quickly. He separates the ego's resistance to change from simple stubbornness and locates it instead in something far more precise: the ego's role as guardian of psychic stability. The ego does not resist transformation because it is weak. It resists because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect the structures that kept the system alive. To ask the ego to let those structures die is not to ask for courage. It is to ask a guard to unlock the cell it has been posted outside of for 30 years. The question worth sitting with is not why you resist. It is what the resistance is guarding. Because underneath the pattern, underneath the need to be needed, the compulsion to perform competence, the exhausting vigilance of the person who never lets things fall apart, there is not a wound, exactly. There is a solution, an old one that worked at a specific moment for a specific version of you that no longer exists, but whose engineering is still running. The perfectionist did not develop their perfectionism arbitrarily. It was a precise adaptation to an environment where imperfection had consequences. The armor was built for a war that ended, but the armor does not know the war ended. This is what makes voluntary dying so much harder than it sounds. You are not being asked to drop a bad habit. You are being asked to retire a strategy that once saved you, and to do it without being entirely sure you are safe enough to survive without it. The grief that Jung describes as the necessary accompaniment to real individuation is, at its core, the grief of trusting the ground enough to stop bracing. Most people never do this because they wait for certainty first. They wait to feel safe before they let the structure go. But the structure is precisely what prevents the feeling of safety from developing. You cannot feel the ground while you are suspended above it. The letting go must precede the landing, not follow it. What this looks like in practice is not dramatic. It is not a single decision or a moment of breakthrough. It is a series of very small refusals of the old self in real time. The moment you do not perform the competence you don't feel. The moment you let the silence sit instead of filling it. The moment you say what is true instead of what is safe. Each one is minor. Each one is a hairline fracture in the structure. Enough of them, and the structure begins to shift. The practical question, then, is not how to kill the old self. It is how to recognize it in the moment it reaches for its usual move, before you have already become it. That recognition is the gap. And the gap, narrow as it is where the whole process actually lives. What fills that gap once you stop reaching is what the next part names. Picture the moment just before you perform, not on a stage, in an ordinary conversation. Someone asks how you are doing, and you pause for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction you decide, as you always decide, to say fine, or good, or busy, but okay. The truth is, sitting right there. You can feel its weight, and you set it down and say fine, and the conversation moves on, and the old self exhales. That exhale is not relief. It is the sound of the structure maintaining itself. Jung's image in Aion is precise in a way that most people miss on first reading. He does not say the descent is avoidable. He does not say you can choose whether to descend. He says you can choose the direction. Anyone destined to descend into a deep pit had better set about it with all the necessary precautions rather than risk falling into the hole backwards. The pit is not a metaphor for crisis. It is a metaphor for the process itself, which is already in motion, whether you are facing it or not. The voluntary descent, then, is not a single dramatic moment. It is not a decision you make once in a therapist's office or after a long night with a book that changed how you see yourself. It happens in the fraction of a second before the exhale, in the pause where you feel the truth and decide what to do with it. Voluntary dying is not an event. It is a practice, repeated at the level of small, unremarkable moments that the old self has been navigating automatically for years. What makes it voluntary is not the scale, it is the awareness. The specific practice Jung implies, and that his clinical work demonstrates, is the development of what he called in his writings on the ego, the capacity to observe the psyche's contents without immediately becoming them, to feel the reach of the old self without completing the reach, to sit inside the impulse toward performance, toward control, toward the familiar move that keeps things stable, and remain there long enough to ask whether the move is being chosen or simply repeated. This is not a meditative exercise. It is not a pause and breathe technique. It is a confrontation, sustained across ordinary life, with the gap between what the psyche reaches for and what you actually are. The reason this is difficult is not that the moments are rare. They are constant. What makes them difficult is that the old self moves faster than the awareness does. By the time you notice the exhale, you have already exhaled. The work of voluntary descent is, at its core, the slow expansion of that gap, getting to the impulse before it has already resolved itself into action. Not through force, but through the repeated practice of catching it one moment earlier each time. And here is the thing nobody says about this process. You will not feel like you are transforming. You will feel like you are failing, repeatedly, at a thing you almost caught. The structure does not announce when it loosens. The old self does not hold a funeral for itself. What you will notice, slowly and unevenly, is that certain moments cost you differently than they used to, that the exhale still comes, but sometimes it comes with the awareness of itself. And in that awareness, something has already shifted. That shift does not resolve into a new self immediately. What it resolves into is the question this video has been approaching from the beginning. Not who you are becoming, but what remains when you stop defending who you were. There is a sentence in Aion that most readers reach and then move past too quickly. Jung writes that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. The sentence is short enough to feel like an aphorism. Compact, quotable, easy to carry away without actually opening. But read it as a clinical description rather than a philosophical observation, and it becomes something else entirely. A precise account of what is happening to you right now, in your actual life, in the specific areas where the old self is still intact, not in general. Specifically, the areas where you feel most controlled by circumstances, where the same situation keeps arriving in different costumes, where the same feeling surfaces in different relationships, where you keep finding yourself at the same impasse with different people. Those are not patterns of bad luck. They are the shape of what has not yet been made conscious. The unconscious is not abstract. It has a precise address, and it expresses itself with a specificity that, once you learn to read it, is almost uncomfortable in its accuracy. This is what changes when the voluntary descent is actually undertaken. Not the content of your life immediately, but the relationship between you and what happens in it. The person who has begun to die consciously does not stop encountering difficulty. They stop being surprised by where the difficulty arrives. They begin to recognize the situation as interior before it has fully materialized as external, which is the only window in which genuine choice exists. Not after the pattern has already run, in the moment before it closes. What remains after the old self loosens its grip is not at first a new self. That is the part the transformation literature skips because it is not comfortable to describe. What remains is a kind of nakedness, a period of not yet knowing what you are outside the structure that held you. Jung describes this as the necessary condition for individuation, not its failure. The formlessness that precedes form, the silence between the identity that ended and the one that has not yet arrived. Most people cannot tolerate this interval and reach instinctively for the next structure to inhabit, the next role, the next ideology, the next version of the old solution in new language. The work is to stay in the interval long enough for something genuinely new to form. You cannot force what comes next, but you can refuse to fill the space prematurely. The practical question you leave this video with is not who you are becoming. It is simpler and harder than that. It is, what is the specific thing you have been reaching for, the role, the behavior, the story about yourself, that the old self needs in order to remain itself, not in theory. In your life, this week, in the situation that keeps recurring. Name it with the precision Jung demanded of his patients. Not, I avoid vulnerability, but the exact moment, the exact move, the exact exhale that maintains the structure. Because the descent does not begin with a decision about the future. It begins with the refusal of one habitual thing, in one real moment, fully conscious of what you are refusing and why. That is the whole practice. It is also the hardest thing you will ever do. If what you heard in this video is still unresolved somewhere in you, if the question it opened hasn't closed, the video appearing on your screen right now was made for exactly that feeling. Click it and keep going.